At 6:07 in the evening, less than a minute after its wheels left the runway, a small white jet carrying a sick child home to her family fell out of the winter sky over a shopping center parking lot in Philadelphia and turned 5 city blocks into a war zone. Nobody who was standing on Cottman Avenue that Friday evening will ever describe it as anything other than the worst thing they have ever witnessed. A fireball rolling down a residential street, a 9-year-old boy running through flames, and a stretch of row houses that had stood quietly for a century, suddenly reduced to smoking brick and ash. This is the story of MedJet's Flight 056, the Learjet 55ER, that crashed in the Ronhurst and Castor Gardens section of Northeast Philadelphia on January 33, 2025, the deadliest aviation disaster in the city's history. The flight had nothing to do with commerce, tourism, or business travel. It was, in the truest sense of the phrase, a mercy flight. 11-year-old Valentina Guzman Murillo, a girl from Mexico who had spent 4 months as a patient at Shriners Hospitals for Children in Philadelphia, being treated for a serious illness, was finally well enough to go home. Earlier that same day, the staff at Shriners had thrown her a small farewell party, the kind of bittersweet celebration hospitals hold when a long-term patient is discharged after months of treatment, surgery, therapy, and uncertainty. Photographs and accounts from people who knew her describe a child who had become something of a fixture on the ward, familiar to nurses and doctors after such a long stay. That afternoon, she said her goodbyes, thanked the people who had cared for her, and was driven to Northeast Philadelphia Airport to begin the long journey home to Tijuana, on the other side of the North American continent from where she had spent the winter fighting for her health. Valentina was not traveling alone. Her mother, 31-year-old Liseth Murillo Osuna, sat beside her, having spent those same 4 months in a foreign country, in a foreign language, keeping vigil over her daughter's recovery. The two of them were the reason the aircraft existed at all that day. The patient and her companion, the people, the entire apparatus of the flight, the medical staff, the pilots, the specially configured jet, existed to bring safely home. Around them were 4 crew members, all identified in the days after the crash as employees of Jet Rescue Air Ambulance, the company that operated the flight under the brand name commonly used in flight tracking data, MedJets, with the call sign MTS-0566. Captain Alan Alejandro Montoya Perales, an experienced pilot with more than 9,000 hours in his logbook, held the controls, assisted by co-pilot Josue de Jesus Juarez, a Mexican aviator with more than a decade of flying experience and roughly 2,600 hours of his own. Both men were fully certified to operate the Learjet 55 and, according to the Federal Aviation Administration, were credentialed to fly in instrument and inclement weather conditions, a detail that would matter given what the sky looked like that evening. Rounding out the crew were 2 members of the medical team who made the flight possible in the first place. Dr. Raul Meza Arredondo, the chief of neonatology at a private Mexican ambulance service, who also practiced medicine at a hospital in Atizapán de Zaragoza, and paramedic Rodrigo Lopez Padilla. 6 people were aboard the aircraft that evening. Every one of them was a Mexican citizen. Every one of them would be dead within a minute of leaving the ground. The aircraft itself, registered in Mexico as XAUCI, was a Learjet 55, a mid-size business jet first developed by Learjet's parent company, Gates Learjet, in the late 1970s and early 1980s as a stretched, wide-body evolution of the smaller Learjet 20 series and 30 series aircraft that had defined the private jet category since the 1960s. The Learjet 55 was distinctive among its siblings for its wide oval fuselage cross-section, which gave the cabin noticeably more headroom and shoulder room than the narrower Learjets that preceded it, and for its winglets, a relatively novel aerodynamic feature at the time of its introduction that reduced drag and improved fuel efficiency. It entered service in 1981, and variants of the type, including the extended-range ER configuration believed to have been involved in this crash, were used for decades afterward by corporate flight departments, charter operators, and increasingly as the original operators retired the type from frontline corporate use, by air ambulance companies that valued the aircraft's cabin size, range, and relatively low acquisition cost on the used jet market. By the 2020s, Learjet as a brand no longer existed. Bombardier, which had acquired Learjet decades earlier, announced in 2021 that it was ending production of the Learjet line entirely and closing the historic Learjet factory in Wichita, Kansas, citing decreasing demand for light and mid-sized business jets relative to larger, more modern aircraft. That decision meant that every Learjet 55 still flying anywhere in the world by 2025, including XAUCI, was by definition an aging airframe, a design more than 4 decades old, being kept airworthy through maintenance, parts support, and the diligence of the operators who continued to fly them. Air ambulance operators, especially those based outside the wealthiest aviation markets, have long relied on this kind of older, second-hand equipment. Airframes that were once flagship corporate jets and were later sold down market as they aged, refitted with stretcher mounts, oxygen systems, cardiac monitors, and the other equipment needed to turn a business jet into a flying intensive care unit. Jet Rescue Air Ambulance, the operator of the flight, is a Mexico City-based air ambulance company that has built its business around exactly this kind of mission, transporting critically or seriously ill patients, often children, between hospitals across Latin America, the Caribbean, and the United States. The company markets itself as a critical care transport specialist capable of moving patients who are too fragile for commercial air travel, equipped with the kind of onboard medical staff and equipment that a scheduled airliner simply cannot provide. Although headquartered in Mexico, Jet Rescue holds the certifications necessary to operate legally in United States airspace, flying under Part 129 of the Federal Aviation Regulations, the section of American aviation law that governs foreign air carriers operating within the United States. In practical terms, that meant the flight from Philadelphia to Tijuana, with its planned refueling stop at Springfield-Branson National Airport in Missouri, was a routine, legally sanctioned international medevac mission of a type that occurs regularly and mostly without incident across American airspace every single day, ferrying patients like Valentina back to their home countries once their treatment in the United States concludes. The evening of January 31, 2025 was not a pleasant one to fly in the northeastern United States. The National Weather Service recorded overcast skies, drizzling light rain, and patchy fog settling over Philadelphia as darkness fell, along with gusty winds that reached roughly 30 miles per hour just before 6 o'clock. The kind of blustery, low-visibility conditions common to the region in the final days of January, uncomfortable for pedestrians and mildly complicating for pilots, but well within the range of weather that instrument-rated crews handle routinely without special difficulty. Northeast Philadelphia Airport, a smaller general aviation field on the northeastern edge of the city, known locally by its identifier PNE, primarily serves private aircraft, flight schools, and charter operations rather than scheduled airline traffic, which meant the departure that evening proceeded through a control tower accustomed to smaller aircraft and a lower volume of traffic than Philadelphia's main international airport a few miles to the south. At 6:06 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the Learjet lifted off from runway 24 and began what should have been an unremarkable climb toward cruising altitude on a southwesterly heading, en route first to Springfield-Branson National Airport in Missouri, where it was scheduled to stop for fuel before continuing on to Tijuana. According to preliminary flight track data later released by the National Transportation Safety Board, the aircraft's air traffic control communications in those opening seconds sounded entirely ordinary. The Philadelphia Tower Controller instructed the crew to switch frequencies and contact Philadelphia Departure Control, reciting the standard handoff Medevac Med Service 056, contact Philly Departure 123.8, and the pilot read the instruction back in an unhurried, routine tone, thanking the controller and wishing them a good day. It was, by every account of the recording later reviewed by investigators, the kind of exchange that happens hundreds of times a day at airports across the country, utterly indistinguishable from any other successful departure. There was no hint of urgency, no unusual phrasing, nothing in the cadence of the voices that would have given a listener any reason for concern. And then, in the space of perhaps 35 seconds, everything went wrong. Radar and ADS-B tracking data show the Learjet climbing steadily on its southwesterly track, angling slightly to the right before rolling into what the NTSB's preliminary report described as a gradual left turn. The aircraft continued through that left turn as it climbed to an altitude of roughly 1,650 feet above mean sea level, a modest height, still well within the initial climb-out phase of any flight. nowhere near the cruising altitude the jet would eventually have needed for its multi-hour journey to Missouri. Then, just 7 seconds after reaching that peak altitude, the data show the aircraft losing height with shocking speed, descending to roughly 1,275 feet before the tracking data cuts off entirely. The last data point investigators were able to recover before impact. Later analysis of the flight's vertical profile, drawn from the same track data, suggested the aircraft's rate of descent in its final seconds may have approached or exceeded 11,000 feet per minute, a figure associated not with a controlled descent but with an aircraft falling essentially out of control, nose down, toward the ground. Bystander video captured in the aftermath, video that circulated widely online within hours of the crash and that investigators would later collect systematically as part of their evidence gathering, appeared to show the jet striking the ground at a steep, almost vertical angle, consistent with the extraordinary descent rate suggested by the radar data. Crucially, at no point during those final seconds did the flight crew transmit a distress call. Investigators would later confirm explicitly that no Mayday or any other emergency communication was received from the cockpit before the aircraft went down, despite the crew remaining, at least nominally, in contact with air traffic control moments earlier. Whatever happened in that cockpit in the final half-minute of the flight, whether it was a catastrophic mechanical failure, a structural problem, a loss of control linked to weather or icing, an incapacitation of the flight crew, or some combination of factors not yet understood, it appears to have overwhelmed the pilots so quickly or so completely that they were unable or did not have time to alert anyone on the ground to what was happening. That silence is one of the most haunting and, for investigators, one of the most frustrating aspects of the entire event, because it offers no verbal clue, no radioed hint of engine trouble or control difficulty to help explain what brought the aircraft down. What is not in doubt is where and how violently the aircraft struck the earth. The Learjet came down along Cottman Avenue, one of Northeast Philadelphia's busiest commercial corridors, directly across from the Roosevelt Mall, an outdoor shopping center near the intersection of Cottman Avenue and Roosevelt Boulevard, one of the most heavily trafficked and densely populated stretches of the entire city, lined with row houses, small businesses, parked cars, and, at that hour on a Friday evening, an ordinary flow of commuters and shoppers making their way home or running weekend errands. The jet's total time in the air, from the moment its wheels left the runway to the moment it struck the ground, was well under a minute. Some accounts put the entire flight at around 22 seconds of actual flying time before catastrophe. NTSB's own preliminary figures describe a flight of roughly 1 minute door to impact, encompassing both the takeoff roll and the brief, doomed climb that followed. However the seconds are counted, the essential fact remains the same: a fully fueled jet aircraft, still carrying most of the fuel load intended to carry it across the country, slammed into a city sidewalk and street at extraordinarily high speed and at a steep angle, only a few miles from the airport it had left less than a minute before. The impact and the explosion that followed it were catastrophic, because the aircraft was loaded with fuel for a long multi-stop journey rather than a short local hop. The resulting fireball was immense, engulfing the immediate impact site and rapidly spreading fire to the row of homes and vehicles nearby. Witnesses described a deafening explosion followed almost instantly by a wall of flame rolling down the block, thick black smoke pouring into the evening sky, and a scene of pure chaos as car alarms wailed. House windows shattered from the shockwave, and people who had been going about ordinary Friday evening business, walking to their cars, driving home from work, sitting inside their own living rooms, found themselves suddenly engulfed in an inferno they had no warning of and no time to prepare for. The debris field left behind by the crash, as later measured by NTSB investigators combing the scene, stretched an extraordinary 1,410 feet in length by 840 feet in width, nearly a quarter of a mile long and more than 2.5 football fields wide, a testament to both the speed of the impact and the violence of the post-crash fire and explosions that scattered wreckage, building materials and debris across a wide swath of the neighborhood. Multiple homes were set ablaze. Numerous vehicles, some occupied, some parked and empty, were engulfed in flame. A dense urban neighborhood of the kind found in cities across America, built for people, not for catastrophe, was transformed within seconds into something closer to a disaster zone. All 6 people aboard the aircraft were killed instantly, or in the immediate aftermath of the crash. There were, in the words of a spokesperson for Jet Rescue Air Ambulance issued in a statement released within hours of the disaster, no survivors to confirm. On the ground, the toll was almost as devastating. A man in a parked or passing vehicle near the point of impact was killed when his car was struck and engulfed in flame, making him the crash's first confirmed fatality among people who had no connection whatsoever to the flight. Ordinary Philadelphians going about an ordinary evening who happened to be in the wrong place at the worst possible moment. In the days that followed, Philadelphia's mayor, Cherelle Parker, confirmed that a second person on the ground, a woman riding in a vehicle nearby, had also died from injuries sustained in the crash, bringing the initial ground toll to 2 and the overall death count to 7. The 6 people aboard the aircraft and 1 Philadelphia area resident killed in the fire that consumed her vehicle. That single number, 7 dead, would not tragically be the final toll. Months later, in early May of 2025, a Philadelphia woman who had been critically injured in the crash succumbed to her injuries, becoming an 8th confirmed fatality and a grim reminder that the human cost of an aviation disaster of this scale often continues to accrue long after the news cameras have moved on and the wreckage has been cleared away. The injured numbered in the dozens. City officials reported that at least 22 to 24 people on the ground were hurt in the crash and its aftermath, ranging from minor injuries such as smoke inhalation and cuts from flying debris to catastrophic, life-altering burns. Philadelphia Mayor Cherelle Parker said in the days following the crash that several of the injured remained hospitalized, with a number of them in critical condition as doctors fought to save lives and limbs. Among the most searing individual stories to emerge from the wreckage was that of a 9-year-old boy named Ramses Vasquez Baena, who had been riding in a car with his father when the vehicle caught fire in the crash's immediate aftermath. A photograph capturing the boy running across the street while his clothing burned became one of the defining, most widely circulated images of the disaster. An unbearable snapshot of a child's ordinary Friday evening transformed in an instant into a fight for his life. Family members later told local reporters that Ramses suffered burns across roughly 90% of his body. He was ultimately transferred to Boston Children's Hospital, one of the country's premier pediatric burn and trauma centers, where he underwent a grueling series of surgeries, including partial amputations of both hands. Nearly a year after the crash, doctors treating him were describing his continued survival as nothing short of a miracle, and his classmates and teachers back home at his Philadelphia elementary school sent him handmade cards and hometown treats to his hospital room in a show of solidarity that captured something of how deeply the tragedy had rippled through the community, well beyond the immediate blast radius of the crash itself. Another Philadelphia area woman, 34-year-old Dominique Goodsberg, who had been riding in a car with her boyfriend and his 9-year-old son when the jet came down and set their vehicle alight, would later die of her injuries as well, becoming, in effect, part of that eventual 8th victim toll that pushed the crash death count beyond the initial figure of 7. The response from Philadelphia's emergency services was immediate and overwhelming in scale, even as first responders themselves grappled with confusion about exactly what had happened in those first chaotic minutes. Police cars and fire engines converged on the scene from across the city, filling nearby parking lots and side streets as officers and firefighters worked simultaneously to fight the spreading blaze, search for survivors amid the wreckage of collapsed and burning homes, and establish a security perimeter around a debris field the size of several city blocks, all while a shocked and frightened public tried to understand what had just happened to their neighborhood. Local television stations that had been broadcasting ordinary Friday evening programming cut immediately to live coverage, and within the hour, footage of the burning wreckage, the darkened smoke plume visible for miles, and shell-shocked residents describing what they had just witnessed was airing on national networks across the United States. President Donald Trump, who had taken office only days earlier and whose administration would go on to confront a string of high-profile aviation incidents in the opening weeks of his second term, posted a message of condolence on the social media platform Truth Social within hours of the crash, writing that it was so sad to see the plane go down in Philadelphia and lamenting the loss of what he called more innocent souls, while adding that federal personnel were totally engaged in responding to the disaster. Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, addressing reporters at the scene later that night, spoke of the extraordinary community response he had witnessed even amid the horror unfolding around him, describing what he called a unified response to an awful aviation disaster. and praising what he characterized as Philadelphians looking out for one another. Neighbors pulling other neighbors from burning cars, strangers opening their homes to displaced families, a city rallying around its own, even as the flames were still being extinguished. That instinct toward mutual aid and neighborly solidarity would define much of the community's response in the days, weeks, and months that followed the crash, even as the physical and emotional scars of that Friday evening remained starkly visible along Cotman Avenue for a long time afterward. Local businesses, many of which had been forced to close in the immediate aftermath as the crash site was treated as an active investigation zone, slowly reopened as cleanup efforts progressed. One area business owner, reflecting on the disaster months later, offered a line that captured something of the resilient, matter-of-fact spirit with which many longtime residents of the neighborhood approached their recovery. He could replace bricks and sticks, he said. The material losses were, in the end, replaceable, and the community had been fortunate that the death toll, however tragic, had not been even higher given the density of the neighborhood and the ferocity of the crash. Shriners Hospitals for Children, the institution that had cared for Valentina during her months of treatment before her fatal journey home, along with numerous other local organizations, stepped forward to offer support to the families of victims and survivors alike, part of a broader outpouring of civic and charitable response that Philadelphia has become known for in the aftermath of tragedy. In the immediate wake of the crash, attention quickly turned to the question every aviation disaster inevitably raises: what caused it? The National Transportation Safety Board, the independent federal agency responsible for investigating civil aviation accidents in the United States, arrived on scene within hours and formally opened an investigation designated ERA 25MA106. NTSB investigators spent the days and weeks that followed painstakingly documenting the wreckage, interviewing witnesses, collecting surveillance footage from businesses and residences along the crash's flight path, and beginning the slow, methodical process of piecing together both the physical evidence scattered across the debris field and the electronic and mechanical evidence embedded in the aircraft's recovered components. Investigators were able to recover both of the aircraft's engines from the wreckage, along with its cockpit voice recorder, found buried roughly 8 feet deep in soil and debris at the site of the initial impact, a discovery that offered investigators genuine hope in the crash's first days that the recorder might hold the crew's final words and the sounds of whatever malfunction or crisis had overtaken the aircraft in its last seconds of flight. The jet's enhanced ground proximity warning system, a computerized unit capable of storing certain flight data alongside its primary function of alerting pilots to terrain hazards, was likewise recovered and shipped off for specialized evaluation, first to the manufacturer's facility and later, alongside the cockpit voice recorder itself, to the NTSB's Vehicle Recorders Laboratory in Washington, D.C., where technicians specialize in extracting usable data from recorders that have been damaged, buried, burned, or otherwise compromised by the violence of a crash. The NTSB released its preliminary report on March 6, 2025, roughly 5 weeks after the crash, a document that, by design, contains only the raw factual findings gathered in a young investigation's opening phase rather than any conclusion about probable cause, which the agency has said would not be expected for somewhere between 12 and 24 months after the accident, in keeping with the NTSB's typical timeline for complex aviation investigations. The preliminary report confirmed the broad outlines of the flight's tragic trajectory, already understood from public radar data and bystander video, the takeoff time, the brief and unremarkable radio exchange with air traffic control, the climb to 1,650 feet, the turn, the catastrophic and rapid descent, and the absence of any distress call. But it also delivered one particularly unsettling revelation that would color much of the subsequent public discussion of the crash. The cockpit voice recorder recovered from 8 feet underground at the impact site, despite investigators' hopes, had not actually recorded the accident flight at all. After painstaking repair and technical evaluation, NTSB officials determined that the device had most likely not been capturing usable audio for several years prior to the crash, a finding suggesting either a long undetected equipment malfunction or a lapse in the kind of routine maintenance checks meant to verify that such safety-critical recording devices remain functional. The revelation stripped investigators of what would ordinarily be one of their single most valuable sources of evidence in a crash of this nature: the actual voices of the pilots in their final moments, any alarms or cockpit warnings that might have sounded, any indication of what, precisely, the crew was experiencing and how they were responding to it as the aircraft began its fatal descent. The absence of a working cockpit voice recorder immediately drew scrutiny from aviation experts and attorneys following the investigation from outside the NTSB itself. Longtime aviation attorney and pilot Arthur Woke, commenting publicly on the preliminary findings, noted that under United States regulations, aircraft configured with 6 or more passenger seats are generally required to carry a functioning cockpit voice recorder, raising pointed questions about how a jet flying international medevac missions in and out of American airspace could have operated for years with a recorder that, investigators believed, had effectively been silent the entire time. Wolk and others also noted that determining whether the crash stemmed from some kind of electrical or structural failure aboard the aging airframe would likely depend heavily on maintenance records for the aircraft. Records that, given the plane's Mexican registration and Jet Rescue's Mexico City base of operations, would most likely originate from Mexican maintenance and regulatory authorities rather than from any American source, adding an added layer of international coordination to an already complex investigation. Former NTSB investigator Alan Deal, offering his own outside analysis in the days after the crash, suggested that among the range of plausible explanations for what brought the jet down, investigators would likely need to closely examine both the aircraft's maintenance history and the experience level and decision-making of its flight crew, while cautioning, as experienced accident investigators invariably do, that a full and reliable explanation would only emerge once the physical and recorded evidence had been fully analyzed rather than through early speculation. What is known, even absent a formal determination of probable cause, paints a picture of an aircraft that behaved in its final moments in a manner utterly inconsistent with a healthy jet under full control. A climb interrupted by a turn, followed almost immediately by an extraordinarily steep and rapid descent, all occurring within roughly 40 seconds of a routine takeoff, with no distress call and, per available evidence, no clear indication of what specifically triggered the sequence. This is the signature not of a gradual mechanical degradation that a crew might have time to diagnose and respond to, but of something sudden and overwhelming. A structural failure, a catastrophic loss of control, possibly linked to the evening's poor weather. Investigators examining the aircraft's flight track have also had to grapple with the plane's final recorded ground speed of 242 knots, at an altitude of only 1,275 feet, a speed considerably higher than would typically be expected for an aircraft still in its initial climb-out, a detail that has fueled speculation, though not yet formal conclusion, about whether the jet may have entered some kind of steep, uncontrolled dive that dramatically accelerated its ground speed in the final seconds, before witness video appearing to show a near-vertical impact angle. Beyond a specific mechanical or procedural questions the investigation continues to probe, the crash of MedJet's Flight 056 quickly became, for many observers of the international air ambulance industry, a moment of reckoning about an area of aviation that receives comparatively little public scrutiny relative to scheduled passenger airline service. Air ambulance flights, particularly those involving small, privately operated jets carrying critically ill patients across international borders, occupy something of a regulatory gray zone in the public imagination, professional and highly regulated in the eyes of the industry itself, yet largely invisible to the traveling public until something goes catastrophically wrong. Aviation journalists and safety analysts covering the crash and its aftermath noted that many air ambulance operators worldwide, particularly those based in countries where the used jet market makes older airframes economically attractive, rely on aircraft that are decades old, purchased second or third hand from corporate flight departments that have moved on to newer equipment and refitted for medical use. This is not in itself evidence of negligence or unsafe practice. Properly maintained older aircraft can and do fly safely for decades, and airframe age alone has never been shown to be a reliable predictor of accident risk in isolation from maintenance quality and operational practices. But the revelation of a cockpit voice recorder that had apparently gone unmonitored and non-functional for years inevitably intensified questions about the rigor of the maintenance and oversight regimes governing at least some corners of the international air ambulance sector, questions that the NTSB's eventual final report, whenever it is completed, is expected to address in far greater depth. The scale of destruction wrought on the ground amplified the crash's significance well beyond the immediate tragedy of the 6 lives lost aboard the aircraft. Northeast Philadelphia is one of the city's most densely populated residential districts, a landscape of tightly packed row houses, small businesses, and heavily trafficked commercial corridors like Cottman Avenue and Roosevelt Boulevard, one of the widest and busiest arterial roads in the entire city. That the Learjet came down precisely in such a location, rather than, as is sometimes tragically the case in general aviation accidents, in an open field, a body of water, or an unpopulated stretch of terrain, meant that an aviation accident that might elsewhere have claimed only the lives of those aboard the aircraft instead tore directly through an occupied civilian neighborhood at the peak of a Friday evening's foot and vehicle traffic. City officials would later describe entire blocks near the Roosevelt Mall as having become, in the mayor's own characterization, almost unrecognizable in the crash's immediate aftermath. Streets littered with wreckage, homes gutted by fire, vehicles reduced to blackened husks. A neighborhood that residents had known intimately for years, suddenly transformed into something closer to a disaster movie set. Local television footage broadcast that night and in the days that followed showed police and fire personnel working amid a scene of near-total devastation along a stretch of the avenue that, just hours earlier, had looked like any other ordinary commercial corridor in any other American city. The identification of victims and the process of returning the 6 Mexican citizens killed aboard the aircraft to their families proceeded in the days and weeks that followed, a process complicated by both the intensity of the post-crash fire, which investigators noted had significantly hampered efforts to recover and identify remains, and by the inherently cross-border nature of the tragedy, which required close coordination between American authorities, including the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office, and Mexican governmental officials working on behalf of the victims' families. The government of Ensenada, the coastal city in Baja California where Valentina and her mother Lizeth had lived, publicly confirmed the identities of the mother and daughter in the days following the crash, offering the kind of official governmental acknowledgement that, however painful, often provides grieving families with a measure of closure and validation amid tragedy. By early February, authorities on both sides of the border had formally identified all 6 victims who had been aboard the flight: Captain Montoya Perales, co-pilot Waradundo, paramedic Lopez Padilla, patient Valentina Guzman Murillo, and her mother Lizeth Murillo Osuna, and in the weeks that followed, their remains were returned to Mexico for burial, bringing at least a Murillo Osuna, and in the weeks that followed, their remains were returned to Mexico for burial, bringing at least a Paris Cleance. Within it for the city of Philadelphia itself, the crash of January 31st, 2025, occupies a singular and unwelcome place in the historical record. By every measure available, it stands as the deadliest aviation-related disaster the city has ever experienced, a designation that reflects both the unusually high combined toll of 6 aircraft occupants and multiple ground fatalities, and the sheer physical scale of destruction inflicted on a residential neighborhood in the span of less than a minute. Philadelphia has a long aviation history, home to several general aviation and municipal airports over the decades, and like any major American city has seen its share of smaller aircraft incidents and accidents over the years. But nothing in the city's recorded history approaches the combined human and physical toll of the Cottman Avenue crash. That grim distinction has shaped much of how the city, its residents, and its elected officials have approached the ongoing process of remembrance, recovery, and reform in the months, and now more than a year that has passed since the disaster. As the first anniversary of the crash approached in late January of 2026, local journalists and news organizations across Philadelphia returned to the neighborhood around Roosevelt Mall to assess how the community had fared in the years since the disaster, producing retrospective coverage that traced both the visible, physical progress of recovery and the less visible, ongoing emotional and psychological toll the crash had left behind. Some homes and storefronts along the affected stretch of Cottman Avenue remained boarded up more than a year later, still awaiting the kind of extensive rebuilding that a disaster of this magnitude requires, while other properties had been repaired, reoccupied, or rebuilt entirely, offering visible, if partial, evidence of a community determined to reclaim its own streets from the memory of catastrophe. Residents who had lived through the crash and its immediate aftermath continued to describe the experience, more than a year on, In stark and haunting terms, traumatizing was a word used repeatedly by neighbors recalling that Friday evening in interviews conducted for anniversary coverage, a single word carrying the weight of an experience that had, for many along that stretch of Cottman Avenue, permanently altered their sense of safety and normalcy in a neighborhood they had called home for years, in some cases for decades. The individual stories that emerged from the wreckage over the ensuing months, meanwhile, offered their own testament to both the scale of the tragedy and the resilience of those who survived it. 9-year-old Ramses Vazquez Viana's long recovery, chronicled by local media throughout 2025, became something of a touchstone for the broader community's understanding of what the crash had cost and what survival, however hard-won, could look like in its aftermath. His treatment at Boston Children's Hospital, the multiple surgeries, the partial amputations, and the outpouring of support from his classmates and teachers back in Philadelphia together formed a narrative thread that many in the city followed closely throughout the year, a single child's ordeal standing in the public imagination, for the far larger, more diffuse suffering experienced by dozens of families across the neighborhood whose stories received less sustained media attention but were, in their own less, profound. The death of Dominique Goodsberg months after the crash and the subsequent death of the unnamed Philadelphia woman who became the disaster's 8th confirmed fatality in early May of 2025 served as painful reminders that the human toll of a disaster of this scale rarely resolves itself neatly on the night of the event itself, but instead continues to accumulate in hospital wards, in burn units, in rehabilitation centers, for weeks and months after the headlines fade, and the wreckage has long since been cleared from the street. Institutionally, the investigation into the crash's cause continued through 2025 and into 2026 along the methodical, deliberate timeline the NTSB had signaled from the very beginning. Beyond the initial preliminary report released in early March of 2025, investigators continued analyzing recovered wreckage, engine components, and whatever data could ultimately be salvaged from the enhanced ground proximity warning system, while also working to reconstruct the aircraft's maintenance history through records obtained from Jet Rescue Air Ambulance and from Mexican aviation authorities, an inherently cross-border undertaking given the aircraft's foreign registration and its operator's base of operations outside American jurisdiction. Investigations of this scope and complexity, involving a 40 adhesional, where any 40 days or any fatalities and dozens of injuries among uninvolved civilians on the ground, and a catastrophic in-flight event with no cockpit voice recording and no distress call to guide investigators toward an early hypothesis. Routinely Takeoff to a Sweeling Ting 2 with MITRE, and a catastrophic in-flight event with no cockpit fight booked, complete with a official detentimadianes, 12 and 24 daily, 20s. It will and the time at Trumdy Revout through Hirek both plank and like we're for dangs and as if Fabalazek Kabul quite the ease with the bit of tinsel with the voice for at a tank barking light would white to know that. In the meantime, the crash has already left a durable mark on public discourse surrounding both general aviation safety and the specific practices of the international air ambulance industry. And representative these Engler align Jachetson and said them with if not release away with fans on a stint spurred shake carding word a coordinate call occasionally, lestings bides at red guarding where leaf the of a schwab tarvinals pumping in a strict gallard. Untied a bobin mic to record a grease pre-quarter. I'd the record a term or to my by King Ward and it's the day kind baby school to die to step into the court like I can fit make it to mix it haven't been it didn't mind about it be kind of telling him my papa now his study of the Gibra weeks cover. None of this read the lyric. With the flinner for this act to replanks for an patminate. Are the wavering to rate of the file of pages of the NTSB's preliminary report, but the lived reality of a Friday evening interrupted by catastrophe. A sick child had finally cleared the gear to go home after months of treatment. Boarding a plane to rate a point of her chopper to wave all there. The quad-eye wave recorded cake eating. Would be K to get to have a tower. 7 people died that night in the initial toll. An 8th death would follow months later. Dozens more carried physical and psychological scars from the fire and the chaos that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. And an entire section of Northeast Philadelphia was forced to rebuild, both literally and emotionally, from a catastrophe that arrived, quite literally, out of a clear or, in this case, overcast, rain-streaked, and foggy winter sky. The crash also arrived at a peculiarly fraught moment for American aviation more broadly. Barely more than 48 hours before the Learjet went down over Cottman Avenue, the country had been consumed by an entirely separate catastrophe, The January 29 mid-air collision near Washington's Ronald Reagan National Airport between an American Airlines regional jet and a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter, a disaster that killed everyone aboard both aircraft and instantly became one of the deadliest aviation accidents on American soil in more than 2 decades. That crash was still dominating national headlines, congressional hearings, and cable news coverage when the Philadelphia disaster struck, and the coincidence of 2 catastrophic, high-fatality aviation events within the same week, at the very start of a new presidential administration, produced an unusually intense and sustained period of public anxiety about air safety in the United States. Newly inaugurated officials at the Department of Transportation and the Federal Aviation Administration found themselves fielding urgent questions about aviation oversight even as they were still settling into their roles. And President Trump himself, whose Truth Social post about the Philadelphia crash was one of several statements he issued about aviation safety in those same tumultuous feast of his second term, would go on to hold a White House press conference addressing both disasters and pledging closer scrutiny of the nation's aviation infrastructure. Aviation historians and safety analysts have since noted that the temporal proximity of the 2 crashes, though almost certainly coincidental in terms of underlying cause, one a mid-air collision involving a commercial airliner and military helicopter in congested airspace near the nation's capital, the other a general aviation medevac crash rooted in circumstances still under NTSB investigation, nonetheless combined to create one of the most anxious and closely scrutinized stretches for American air travel in recent memory, wailed in stained then lightly highlight. That broader atmosphere of scrutiny shaped how the Philadelphia crash was covered and understood, even beyond its own immediate localized tragedy, where an isolated general aviation accident involving a foreign-registered medevac jet might, in an ordinary news cycle, have received a few days of intense local coverage before receding from the national conversation. The Learjet 55 crash instead remained part of a sustained, weeks-long national reckoning with aviation risk, examined alongside the Reagan National collision and several other smaller aviation incidents that occurred in that same turbulent stretch of early 2025. Members of Congress cited the Philadelphia crash in hearings on aviation oversight. Aviation trade publications ran extended investigative pieces examining the air ambulance industry's safety record more broadly, and federal regulators faced renewed pressure to examine whether foreign-registered air ambulance operators flying regularly into American airspace under Part 129 authority were subject to sufficiently rigorous oversight of their maintenance practices, their equipment, and their flight crews' training and currency. Jet Rescue Air Ambulance, for its part, issued several public statements in the days following the crash, expressing condolences to the families of all those killed, both aboard the aircraft and on the ground, and pledging full cooperation with the NTSB's investigation. Company spokesperson Shay Gold, who spoke with several national news outlets in the crash's immediate aftermath, confirmed key details about the mission's purpose and the identities of those aboard, describing a routine and carefully planned repatriation flight for a young patient whose treatment in Philadelphia had concluded successfully, only for the journey home to end in catastrophe. The company, which has operated for years as one of the more prominent air ambulance providers serving the corridor between the United States and Latin America, faced intense scrutiny of its safety and maintenance practices in the months following the crash, scrutiny that intensified considerably once the NTSB's preliminary report revealed the apparently long-dormant cockpit voice recorder. Aviation trade press and mainstream outlets alike sought comment from the company regarding how such a lapse could have gone undetected for years, though detailed answers to those questions remained elusive throughout 2025, pending the completion of the NTAC's fuller investigation into the aircraft's maintenance history. The technical work of the investigation itself, meanwhile, proceeded through channels largely invisible to the public but critical to eventually understanding what happened aboard XAUCI in its final seconds. The NTSB's Vehicle Recorders Laboratory in Washington, D.C., the same facility responsible for extracting data from black boxes recovered from crashes around the world, including recorders damaged by fire, submerged in water, or, as in this case, buried under feet of soil and debris, undertook the painstaking process of disassembling, cleaning, and attempting to recover any usable information from both the cockpit voice recorder and the enhanced ground proximity warning system pulled from the wreckage on Cottman Avenue. Recorder specialists at facilities of this kind routinely work with severely damaged components, sometimes successfully recovering fragments of data from devices that appear, to a layperson, to be little more than scorched and twisted scrap metal. The confirmation that the cockpit voice recorder aboard the Learjet had not been capturing audio for several years prior to the crash, as the NTSB's preliminary report put it, was itself the product of exactly this kind of painstaking examination, rather than an immediately obvious finding available the moment the device was pulled from the ground. Engineers and metallurgists examining the aircraft's recovered engines, meanwhile, worked in parallel to determine whether any pre-impact mechanical failure might have contributed to the crash, tracing damage patterns, examining internal components for signs of fatigue, foreign object damage, or fire damage that could indicate whether one or both engines were producing normal power in the moments before impact, or whether some kind of propulsion failure might have precipitated or contributed to the aircraft's final catastrophic descent. Structural engineers and airframe specialists, similarly, worked to reconstruct as much of the aircraft's physical condition as the fire-ravaged wreckage would allow, searching for evidence of pre-existing corrosion, fatigue cracking, or other structural deficiencies that might be expected in an airframe as old as the more than 4-decade-old Learjet 55 involved in the crash, while also examining the wreckage for evidence of in-flight structural failure, a wing, control surface, or other critical component separate from the aircraft the rate strike that it what and when quitted. Investigators of this kind typically work from the wreckage outward, mapping precisely where each piece of debris came to rest across the sprawling 1,410 by 840-foot debris field in order to reconstruct, in reverse, the sequence in which the aircraft broke apart, information that can prove critical in distinguishing between a crash caused by pre-impact structural failure and one in which the aircraft remained largely intact until it struck the ground, only breaking apart from the force of impact itself and the subsequent post-crate care fire Beyond the purely technical dimensions of the investigation, the crash also prompted renewed public and journalistic interest in the broader safety record of the Learjet 55 as an aircraft type, and of aging business jets converted to medevac use more generally. Aviation databases and accident history researchers, examining the type's service record across more than 4 decades of operation worldwide, noted that the Learjet 55, like most aircraft of its era and class, had experienced a number of accidents and incidents over the decades it had been in service, spread across the hundreds of examples built and operated by corporate flight departments, charter companies, and medevac operators around the globe. A safety record that aviation analysts generally does remarkable relative to comparable aircraft of its extraneous, rather than one the way. That context mattered to investigators and outside observers alike, because it meant the Philadelphia crash was unlikely, on its own, to prompt any kind of fleet-wide grounding or emergency airworthiness directive targeting Learjet 55 specifically. Rather, the crash's significance for broader aviation safety policy seemed, as 2025 wore on, more likely to center on operator-specific maintenance practices, regulatory oversight of foreign Part 199 carriers, and the verification of safety equipment like cockpit voice rakers, than on an end. For the residents of the neighborhood surrounding Roosevelt Mall, however, questions of regulatory policy and airframe engineering, however important to the long-term prevention of future disasters, mattered considerably less in the immediate aftermath than the practical, day-to-day work of putting their lives and their community back together. In the weeks following the crash, the city of Philadelphia established support services for displaced families, working alongside the Red Cross and local charitable organizations to provide temporary housing, financial assistance, and counseling for residents whose homes had been destroyed or rendered uninhabitable by the fire and the crash's shockwave. Local churches and community centers in Northeast Philadelphia, several of which sit only blocks from the crash site, opened their doors in the days immediately following the disaster, offering shelter, warm meals, and a gathering place for neighbors trying to process what had happened and check on one another's safety. Philadelphia's school district, meanwhile, worked to support students at nearby schools, including Mastery Charter Smedley Elementary, the school attended by young Ramses Vasquez Viana, whose classmates and teachers organized care packages and messages of encouragement that were sent to him throughout his long hospitalization and recovery, small gestures that nonetheless carried outsized emotional significance for a child fighting to recover from injuries few adults, let alone 9-year-olds, are ever asked to survive. Local elected officials, for their part, used the anniversary of the crash and the months surrounding it to press for continued investment in the affected neighborhood and for greater transparency from federal investigators regarding the timeline and eventual findings of the NTSB's inquiry. City council members representing Northeast Philadelphia held community forums throughout 2025 to update residents on rebuilding efforts, address ongoing concerns about property damage claims and insurance disputes stemming from the crash, and provide what limited updates were available regarding the pace of the federal investigation, even as the NTSB's own rules generally prevented investigators from commenting publicly on specific findings or hypotheses before the release of a final report. Mayor Parker, who had taken office little more than a year before the crash and found herself, in just the second month of the new year, managing the response to the deadliest aviation disaster in her city's history, continued throughout 2021 to cite the crash and its aftermath as a formative moment of her early tenure, one that had tested the city's emergency response capabilities, its capacity for interagency coordination between local, state, and federal authorities, and its ability to care for a traumatized community in the full glare of national and international. Internationally, the crash also drew sustained attention from Mexican media and government officials, given that all 6 people aboard the aircraft were Mexican citizens and the operating company itself was headquartered in Mexico City. Mexican consular officials in Philadelphia worked closely with American authorities throughout the identification and repatriation process, while officials in Ensenada, the hometown of Valentina Guzman Murillo and her mother Lizeth Murillo Osuna, held their own public remembrances for the mother and daughter whose journey home from months of life-saving medical treatment had ended instead in tragedy. The story of Valentina's illness, her treatment at Shriners Hospitals for Children, and her death alongside her mother on what should have been the final leg of a hard-won recovery resonated powerfully across Mexican media throughout 2025, transforming what might otherwise have been reported in a purely American context, primarily as a domestic aviation disaster, into a genuinely binational tragedy, mourned and remembered on both sides of the border. As of the middle of 2026, with the crash's investigation still ongoing and its final report not yet released, MedJet's Flight 056 remains a case study cited repeatedly by aviation safety analysts, journalists, and policymakers examining the intersection of general aviation, international medevac operations, and dense urban airspace. It is, in the grimmest possible sense, a nearly perfect illustration of how a single, catastrophic failure, whatever its ultimate, still undetermined cause turns out to be, can radiate outward from a single aircraft to claim lives and alter the fabric of an entire community that had no connection whatsoever to the flight itself, beyond the simple, terrible misfortune of living along the flight path of an aircraft in its final, doomed seconds of controlled flight. The people of Cottman Avenue did not choose to be part of this story. Valentina Guzman Murillo did not choose to be sick, and her mother did not choose to spend 4 months of her life at her daughter's hospital bedside far from home, only to lose her life on the journey back. The flight crew did not choose for their final radio transmission a calm, routine acknowledgement of a frequency change, followed by a cheerful, "Thank you, good day," to become, in retrospect, one of the last things anyone would ever hear them say. And yet all of these threads, utterly unconnected before that Friday evening in January, were bound together forever in the space of roughly 40 seconds and one violent, fiery impact along one of Philadelphia's busiest streets. More than a year on, the crash of MedJet's Flight 056 remains, in the words used repeatedly by those who covered it and those who lived through it, the deadliest aviation disaster in Philadelphia's history, a tragedy born of a mission of mercy that ended instead in catastrophe. A reminder both of how routinely and safely aircraft like Valentina's Learjet complete missions of exactly this kind around the world, every single day, and of how devastatingly, unpredictably, and instantaneously that routine is shattered. The investigation continues. The final report, when it eventually arrives, may finally answer the questions that have lingered since that Friday evening in January 2025. What, precisely, went wrong in the cockpit of XAUCI in the roughly 40 seconds between a calm, routine radio exchange and a catastrophic, silent plunge into a crowded city street? Until then, the people of Cottman Avenue and Roosevelt Mall continue rebuilding their neighborhood, brick by brick, block by block, carrying with them the memory of a night none of them will ever be able to forget. Every anniversary that passes without a final NTSB report is, for the families involved, its own quiet form of hardship, a continued state of not quite knowing that trails behind every other form of grief a sudden, violent loss produces. Families of the flight crew in Mexico, families of the medical staff who died trying to bring a sick child safely home, the family of Valentina and Lizeth in Ensenada, and the Philadelphia families who lost loved ones or watched them suffer catastrophic injuries in a disaster that had nothing to do with anything they had done. All continue waiting for the same document, a final, authoritative accounting of why an ordinary Friday evening medevac, executed by an experienced crew under a routine and unremarkable radio exchange, whatever that report ultimately concludes, a maintenance failure, a structural defect in an aging airframe, a weather-related loss of control, a mechanical malfunction investigators have not yet been able to fully characterize, or some combination of causes layered atop one another in the way so many aviation disasters ultimately prove to be. It will not undo the loss experienced along Cotman Avenue, at the Roosevelt Mall, and in the homes and hospital rooms where survivors continue, more than a year later, to recover. It may, if the NTSB's process functions as intended, help ensure that whatever specific failure brought down XAUCI on the last day of January 2025 is identified clearly enough and addressed thoroughly enough that no other family in Philadelphia or Mexico or anywhere else an aging medevac jet carries a sick child home has to learn the same lesson the same way.